Hi, welcome to another Urban Outdoorsman SoCal video. My name is Danny Milton, and today we're going to be talking about the 2020 Canyons Drive CF Model 8.0. So I was lucky enough to demo this bike out in Sedona at the Sedona MTB Festival about a month ago. So in this review, I'm not going to show a lot of the footage I captured while I was on the bike. I previously put out a video of the 2 downhill runs that I did on the bike on Grand Central, and if you want to watch that video, you can click that link right there. Before we get into the review, please do all that fun stuff for me. Hit that like button, share, comment, subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. Just as reference, I am 6'2", about 240 pounds, and all of the dimensions that I'm going to talk about are for the extra large frame. So for the initial feel of this bike, I'm going to show you some of the video that I captured riding from the festival site out to Grand Central, and then the first kind of, starter part of Grand Central where you're kind of going through some cutbacks and, little up and down sections here and there. Feels good. The reach feels fine. The suspension is quick. Feels like the rebound is set pretty high. I might turn that down a little bit just for the first run. It's a little more, the rebound feels quick and soft, but not like Ibis Cloud-like soft, but it still feels good. I'm on the road before we get to the trail, and I'm trying to see the feel difference between the click and the clack, just kind of bouncing it. Feels like a little bit less travel in the rear, not a whole lot. I do definitely hear like the flip chip switching when I go from the uphill mode to the downhill mode. Yeah, there's a little more bounce in the back. It's not a crazy difference though. The little drop off, the drop into the river, and the drop off right there at the top of Adobe Jack. Got this little stuff here before we get to Grand Central climb. Feeling good. I put the rebound on the front shock and the rear shock like right in the middle. Feels much better, a little more solid. This is just kind of like the initial feel. I don't want to get too crazy in this stuff until I get a feel of how the bike's gonna ride. Thanks guys, just me. Woo! So now we're gonna talk about climbing, and Canyon's biggest selling point to this bike is the Shapeshifter. The Shapeshifter is going to change this bike, according to them, from an enduro bike into a trail bike, meaning it's going to descend like an enduro bike and climb just as well as a trail bike. What the Shapeshifter does is it's going to change some of the geometries of the bike, and we're going to go over those in just a second. But the main thing is it's going to change leverage curves and how the bike is going to feel under different scenarios. And to give you more of a kind of in-depth look into how a lot of those things change a bike, like the anti-rise, the anti-squat, how the bike is going to react while you're braking and all those kinds of things. There's another YouTube channel that I watch a lot. It's called Trail POV. I will put a link down in the description so you can find that person's channel as well. He goes over a bunch of different suspension types, like the DW link of the Ibis. He goes over the Yeti suspension, the Ransom, the 4-link bar suspension. I also mentioned him in my YT video. He's going to go much more into depth into how all of those different things, curves and leverage ratios, things like that, are going to change the way your bike feels. Climbing is probably the hardest part for bike companies to get their bike to do well. Almost everybody can make a bike that goes downhill really well. It's trying to find a bike that will do both climb and go downhill as well. Like for instance, my Giant Rain is amazing downhill. It's horrible uphill, and I've gone over several bikes in the past, like the Yeti SB150 and the Ibis Ritmo V2, both great uphill and downhill. So let's take a look a little bit more into what the Shapeshifter is going to do and see if this bike will be able to do the same. So the whole point of the Shapeshifter is to basically kind of have 2 bikes in one. With a push of the button going from either downhill mode or uphill mode, this bike is supposed to go from an enduro slacked out bike to a really good climbing machine. And I've looked through Canyon's website, a little bit of digging, and basically it's going to, if you're in downhill mode and the head tube angle is 66 degrees and the seat tube angle is 73.5 degrees in downhill mode, when you switch into that uphill mode, which is the click mode, it steepens up the seat tube angle by 1.5 degrees. And as far as I can tell, I couldn't find exactly, I would assume...
You should never assume, because when you assume, you make an ass of you and me.
It would also steepens the head tube angle 1.5 degrees. So basically what that Shapeshifter does is it kind of rotates that entire front triangle up, meaning that it steepens that seat tube angle, it steepens the head tube angle, it also raises the bottom bracket, and what it does is it changes the travel of the rear shock from 150 millimeters to 125. So in essence, it's changing all of those leverage curves to make the bike more efficient pedaling uphill. Hopefully less pedal bob, hopefully a little bit more nimble as you're going through some of those switchbacks uphill and things like that. And then when you go from the click mode to the clack mode, which is the downhill mode, it puts all of those head tube angles and seat tube angles back, makes them slacker, gets back to that 66 degree head tube angle, back into the slacker seat tube angle. It lowers the BB height. It extends the rear shock from 125 back up to 150. And what all that's going to do, it's going to let you sit down lower in the bike, making it easier on those descents. So the big question is, does it work? I mean, is it just some type of gimmick that Canyon came up with, or is there an actual, perceptible feel between the two modes? And the biggest thing that I could take away from it when you're going from the slack mode into the uphill or click mode is that there was definitely less rear shock sag when you're sitting down on the bike and pedaling. As part of the initial feel that I was showing you, I was bouncing the bike up and down. And on a couple of the climbs, I would go, from the click mode down into the clack just to see if there was a different feel. And definitely in the click mode, the rear end feels much stiffer. Like I said, the bike doesn't sag as much, so you're sitting up higher, and it does make it easier to pedal. So when you go from the clack mode to the click mode, the uphill climbing part, it has a very similar feel to if you have a shock that has a multiple switch lever, kind of like going from lockout to trail climbing to fully open or downhill mode. It has a very similar feel to when you go from fully open to that trail climbing mode. Basically, it just kind of stiffens up that rear shock. The rear shock isn't going to sag as much, so it does make it easier for you to climb. So one of the bikes I rode before this was the Ibis Ritmo V2. And both of these bikes had the same exact drivetrain. They had the XT drivetrain with the 10 to 51 tooth rear cassette. The only difference is that the Canyon Strive has a shorter crank. On the extra large frame, it has 170 millimeter cranks. So it did have a little bit more torque in that low end because you're spinning a shorter crank. And it had a really good feel. And the other thing with that shorter crank and possibly lifting that bottom bracket in the click mode, getting it farther away from the ground, I think of all of the climbing that I did, even at the end, going back and forth across the river where there's a lot of kind of bouncy, rocky sections, I might have had one pedal strike the whole day, whereas with the Ritmo V2, I had not dozens, but I had a lot. So this bike definitely did a lot better as far as not having pedal strikes. So this bike did a really good job going down Grand Central. It was very poppy. It was a very playful bike. It was a lot of fun to ride this bike. The suspension did a really good job on all of the rock gardens. At the very top, you have kind of like that staircase section and then like a big kind of huck. And it did great in the staircase part. When I sent it kind of, a little bit, watch the video. I sent it, it landed really softly. And was very controllable into that next turn. Two of the later kind of drop-off sections that I had, it did a really good job. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and it handled everything really well. Also, near the end of the trail, there's a couple of little fast flowy sections where there's not really a jump lip, but if you kind of, you know, get speed, you can pop up into the air.
Yeah, it's really easy to get up in the air.
And this bike was really easy. Of all the bikes that I rode out in Sedona, this bike was probably the poppiest. Is that a word? I don't know. But going off those little jumps and kind of like bunny hopping air, it was really easy to do, and it was very springy. Not uncontrollable springy and not a bad springy feeling, but just really fun to just get up in the air and do some, you know, stupid stuff. Basically, my only concern for this bike before I ride it was the stack height. Some 29ers that have a higher stack height have kind of a problem, Santa Cruz.
What? Say what again?
With how nimble they feel on the front end and how much front end traction they have, unless you're like really up on those handlebars. And this bike's stack height is 658 millimeters, which is kind of high for some of the 29ers. Just for comparison, the Ritmo V2, which I rode earlier that day, also a 29er, the stack height on that bike is 640 millimeters. So an 18 millimeter difference was kind of a concern for me.
That's what she said.
Basically what happens is on some of those other bikes, they understeer for me. When you start getting into like faster turns, even slower turns, the bike won't go where you want it to go. And also it just won't have the same kind of front end traction. If you watched any of the downhill videos that I did on Grand Central, that did not happen at all. The bike had plenty of front end traction. It never felt like it was kind of drifting away from me. There was no understeer. It did great on the downhill sections, and it was a lot of fun. Okay, so overall, I had a really good time on this bike. It was, I don't know what it was, there was just something really fun about riding this bike, and I had a great time on the trail. Hopefully, when all this coronavirus stuff is over, I'll be able to go down to the San Clemente headquarters and do another demo on this bike and take it out to some of the trails there. There is one that is a pretty good trail called NASCAR, so look forward to doing that. Quickly, a couple of things that I didn't like about the bike. I don't have any video of it, but while I was riding this bike, especially on the climbs, for me, what was happening as I was going through the pedal stroke, when I would, on the upstroke of either pedal, my calves were rubbing the rear triangle, the top part of the rear triangle as part of that motion. And I thought maybe I had too small of a pedal or whatever. I mean, I'm a bigger guy and I do have probably larger than average calves. So it's probably not something that most people are going to have to worry about. But if you are a bigger person or you have larger calves than normal, I guess, it may be something that you might worry about. I would definitely recommend demoing the bike, or at least go to a showroom that has one and get on it and try that out. It wasn't a really bad feeling, like I didn't get bruised or anything like that, but it was just something, you know, that I thought I would point out that happened to me. I figured I would point it out to you and let you know, but for most people, it's not going to be a big concern. And the one other thing that I didn't like about the bike is there's something about the way that the stem and the handlebar looks, that contact point. I don't like the way the stem looks. It doesn't look cool. You know what I mean? It doesn't have that second type of cool look to it. You know, some stems are super lasered and cut out and they look really cool and whatever. And it's just, there's just something about just the way the Canyon stem and handlebar combination looks that I just don't like. It's probably something that I could change. Not something that anybody would need to change. I'm sure it works perfectly fine. It's just one of those kind of visual things that I didn't like about it. Now, some of the pros. The biggest pro of this bike is that A, it's factory direct, but the second part of that, or the B part of that, is that it's only $4,200 for this Model 8. You're getting a carbon framed bike, a long travel 29er with great Fox suspension, and in my opinion, the best combinations of XT 4-piston brakes and the XT drivetrain for $4,200. I mean, that's crazy. You're getting really great spec'd components for this bike for a very little price. However you feel about the Shapeshifter device on this bike, it does work well. There is a definite kind of advantage as far as switching it into that uphill mode and then vice versa, switching to the downhill mode. It's not a crazy difference. Like, it's not going to go from like a, you know, a trail bike to a downhill bike, but it does help, and anything that helps is good in my books. I mean, this is going to get you up the hill just a little bit faster, and it's also going to be, you know, great on the downhills. This is definitely a bike that I would recommend to anyone, you know, beginner, intermediate, or advanced. I mean, this is the bike that the Canyon, I guess, what Enduro squad uses, is the Strive model. I'm sure they, you know, tweak the suspension and things like that, but this is the frame that they ride. So, I mean, that speaks volumes as to, you know, how well they're doing and how good this bike can be. You know, they do have a cheaper model than this, and they have I believe two other ones that are a little bit more expensive. So, I mean, you know, even this model is 8.0 for $4,200 is a great price, and you're getting great suspension, great drivetrain and brakes, and, you know, there's not much more I can say than that. All right, so thanks a lot for watching my video. I really appreciate it. Make sure you do all that stuff: like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel. Let me know down in the comments if you have this bike and what you think of it, how it's been working for you. If you plan on buying this bike pretty soon, yeah, tell me all that stuff. Leave those down in the comments. I'd really appreciate that as well. And the last thing you're going to do is click on one of these boxes in the corner. One's going to take you to another bike. Another one's going to take you to another ride. And click that logo down in the corner, the Urban Outdoorsman SoCal logo, to subscribe. Thanks a lot.